At 1:20 in the morning, thin snow drifted across the Calumet docks, and Cormac Rourke sat in his car and did not bother rolling the window all the way down. He lowered it 4 inches, enough for the man standing out in the cold to hear his voice, not enough for the man to imagine he'd been invited in. "You're 4 months behind," Cormac said, without looking up. He checked his watch. "It's 1:20 now. Until 2 o'clock you still own the shop." The window went up. The car rolled on toward Warehouse D. 29 minutes later, the powerful man on the waterfront was lying beneath the 30 tons of steel shelving, and the blood coming out of his thigh wasn't running, it was pulsing, short bright bursts, each one his own heart working hard to finish him off. Maren Delaney was 7 months pregnant. She was carrying a tray of dirty dishes out to the bins behind the restaurant kitchen when she heard the steel go. She should have called someone. She should have stayed where she was. But her grandmother had once told her something she'd never been able to unhear, even on the nights she wanted to. Nobody gets to choose the hour they become the only person there. She set the tray down, she went in, and when she knelt on that cold concrete sideways, one hand bracing her belly, because kneeling straight was something her body had stopped allowing, when she tore off her apron and pressed it into the wound, when she pulled the pallet strap loose and slid a steel ladle handle through it for a windlass, when she twisted it until the man underneath all that steel roared, and she did not stop, that was when she saw it. On his wrist, an anchor, and 3 numbers beneath it. 1, 4, 7. Maren Delaney froze for exactly half a second, because she had seen that tattoo before, for she had seen it every morning for 4 years, on the wrist of the man she used to call her husband, the man who bled out on this same waterfront 6 months ago, in 11 minutes, while she stood in a kitchen 4 miles away, folding a towel. She looked down at her own bloody hands. Then she gave the windlass one more turn. "Don't sleep," she said. "You look at me. If this story reached you, leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you can walk the rest of this road with Maren." The phone lay on the concrete floor, 2 handspans from her knees, its screen split by a diagonal crack that had been there since October. Maren pressed the speaker button with her knuckle because neither of her hands was clean anymore. The dispatcher answered after the second ring. She gave her name first, clearly, Wedwin Mrendlany, D as in Delta Elaney. Then she gave the address, Warehouse D, Calumet Harbor. "The 3rd gate from Torrance Road. Gray rolling door. It's already open. Just come straight inside." She heard her own voice and was startled by how calm it sounded. Inside her chest, an animal was beating its wings, but the voice coming from her mouth belonged to Perpetua Doyle, 30 years in the emergency room. The voice the older woman had once used to read vital signs to doctors while the world collapsed around her. The dispatcher asked about the victim's condition. Maren said there was a major wound to the upper third of the right thigh, and that she had applied a tourniquet at 1:52 in the morning. She paused for a single beat. "Please write that time down for me." 1:52. The dispatcher asked whether she was a medical professional. Maren said no. She offered no further explanation. Then she lowered her voice until it was barely loud enough for the phone to hear, as though speaking softly might make what she was about to say a little less real. "I'm 7 months pregnant. If I pass us out before you get here, this man still has a tourniquet on. Don't remove it. Don't let anyone remove it because it looks ugly. It's ugly, but it's keeping him alive." The other end of the line went silent for half a second, and in that half second, Maren heard the typing stop. Then the dispatcher said the ambulance was on its way and would be there in 6 minutes. Maren said thank you, and she meant it, because 6 years of waiting tables had taught her that people rarely thanked those who worked at 2 o'clock in the morning. Cormac Rourke's radio lay 3 meters away, thrown from his coat pocket when the rows of shelving came down, its green light still blinking steadily in the darkness like a patient eye. Maren looked at it. She knew that if she reached for it, she could call anyone in the harbor, and they would arrive faster than the ambulance. She didn't reach. She stayed where she was, one hand pressing where pressure was needed, the other gripping the handle of the steel ladle, and she let the radio remain where it had fallen, blinking in the dark, because she understood something people who had never worn a uniform would never understand. When everything was over, someone would stand in this room, look down at the floor, and ask who had touched what. And when that question was asked, they wouldn't ask the people wearing suits. They would ask her. She had been asked that question when she was 23, in another restaurant, about money she had never even seen, and she had learned the lesson through 9 months of unanswered applications and phones that never rang. So she left the radio exactly where it had fallen, 3 meters away. She could live with 3 meters. Running footsteps echoed from the corridor, heavy and uneven, the steps of a man who was 58 and still believed he was 40. Gideon Pike stopped in the doorway, and his whole body faltered, as though someone had pulled out his spine and put it back in the wrong place. He had worked night security at this harbor for 6 years. He had seen many things collapse. He had never seen this collapse. "Merciful God," he said, and his voice broke in the middle. Then he looked down at the woman kneeling crookedly on the floor, 7 months pregnant, her apron no longer recognizable as an apron, and his face changed a second time. "The coffee girl," he said. "Dear God, the coffee girl." For 6 years he had eaten dinner at the Longshore Room, medium rare steak, mashed potatoes, black coffee without sugar, every Tuesday and Friday night, table number 9, near the window. For 6 years she had poured his coffee, and for 6 years he had never read the name tag pinned to her chest. Marin didn't think about that now. She only said, "Mr. Pike, come here. Lift this beam 1 handspan, no more. No more, do you hear me? If you lift it any higher, everything above it will come down." Gideon dropped to his knees, wedged his shoulder to the steel beam, and together they lifted. He counted. She counted. The beam rose exactly 1 handspan, and Marin pulled the man another 40 centimeters free. Far enough that his chest was no longer pinned, far enough for air to find a way inside. The ambulance arrived at 1:58 in the morning. Red light swept across the shipping containers stacked in the yard, swept over the corrugated metal walls, swept across Marin's face, disappeared, then swept over her again. They lifted Cormac Rourke onto a stretcher, and a female paramedic with her hair tied high looked at the tourniquet made from a pallet strap and the handle of a steel ladle, then raised her eyes to Marin without saying a word. Someone said they needed a person to ride along, someone who had been there when it happened. Gideon looked at her. "Go on, child. I'll stay and call the office." Inside the cramped ambulance, beneath white lights that made every face look half dead, Cormac Rourke opened his eyes. He opened them, and he didn't panic. That was the first thing Marin noticed. People woke inside ambulances and panicked. They asked where they were. They called for their mothers. This man opened his eyes, looked around the compartment for exactly 2 seconds, and Marin saw that he was counting people, counting doors. Then his eyes stopped on her. "Did you see anyone leave?" he asked. His voice was barely more than breath, but it wasn't the breath of a man pleading. It was the breath of a man waiting for an answer. Marin said, "Mr. Rourke, you're badly hurt, you mustn't. Answer me." No. 2 words, and within those 2 words, Marin Delaney understood something she would carry with her for many months afterward. This man had lost nearly 1/3 of the blood in his body. He was lying on a stretcher. 3 minutes earlier, he had been that close to death, and the first question he asked when he opened his eyes wasn't whether he would live. It was who had walked away. She had just saved a very dangerous man. She said, "I didn't see anyone." He accepted the answer and closed his eyes, and she thought he was gone. But his lips moved one more time, and the name slipped from his mouth as softly as something dropped long ago that had only now reached the ground. "Rowan." The paramedic didn't look up. The ambulance turned left onto 95th Street, its siren crying through the rows of darkened warehouses. Marin Delaney sat perfectly still. Her hand was still wrapped around the handle of the steel ladle, holding it with exactly the same pressure, not loosening even slightly. She said nothing. Only her face changed. Mercy Southside Hospital at 2:30 in the morning had a kind of light found nowhere else in the world, white and even and shadowless, a light that made everyone look the same, and no one look healthy. They pushed the stretcher through a pair of swinging doors, and Marin managed to follow for 4 steps before a hand came up across her chest, gentle but firm, and she stopped because she was accustomed to stopping when someone blocked her way. The stretcher vanished behind a curtain, and she remained in the middle of the corridor with both hands held slightly above her hips, the way people held their hands when they were dirty and didn't know where to put them. A lanky male nurse with closely cropped hair and the name Whitfield pinned to his chest stepped out from behind the curtain, searched for her with eyes of 3 seconds, then came straight toward her. "Who put on that tourniquet?" he asked. No greeting, no apology. This entire corridor ran on time, not courtesy. I did, Marin said. He looked at her. Do you work in medicine? No, sir. I wait tables. He didn't react. He didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't smirk, didn't say anything about how unexpected that was. He only looked down at the object they had just cut from the man's thigh and placed in a steel tray, a frayed length of orange pallet strap and a steel ladle handle bent at one end, and he studied it a little longer than necessary. Then he looked at her belly. Then he picked up his pen, wrote 2 lines on the clipboard, and said nothing at all. That was everything. No praise, no criticism, no further questions. He simply wrote, and it was that silence that made Marin begin talking. Because 6 years of standing beside other people's tables had taught her that silence was always filled with the worst thing anyone could imagine, and if she didn't fill it herself, someone else would do it for her. My grandmother was a nurse, she said. Her voice trembled, though not from the cold. She worked at Cook County for 30 years, in the emergency room. She taught me. I only remembered what she used to do. I didn't invent any of it myself. I saw the blood coming out in pulses instead of flowing steadily. So I knew it was an artery. I applied pressure first, and when pressure didn't work, I stopped it higher up. My grandmother said if pressure doesn't work, stop it above the wound. I only did what she told me. I wrote down the time, 1:52. I already told the dispatcher. She heard herself speaking, and she hated the sound of it, the voice asking permission to have a place in her own story, the voice of someone who already knew she would be asked why. Nurse Whitfield looked up. He let her finish. Then he said, "Sit down in that chair for me." "But I'm fine. I told you to sit down," he said, his voice still flat, and she sat. They wrapped a blood pressure cuff around her arm, and the machine beeped once, then beeped again, and he checked it a second time by hand. 142/91, he said to someone behind the curtain. A young female doctor came over, pressed a hand against Marin's belly, and asked whether she had felt any tightening. Marin said yes, since she was in the warehouse perhaps 5 or 6 times. Did it hurt? No. It just tightened, then softened again. The doctor nodded, said a few words in Latin, then translated them as false contractions. Not labor yet, but they were her body's way of telling her that she had already used up everything she had to give. "How many weeks are you?" 31 weeks. "When was your last examination?" Marin was silent for a beat. 9 weeks ago. The doctor was silent for a beat too. "You need bed rest," she said. "At least 24 hours, no prolonged standing and no heavy lifting." "I need to work at 7 o'clock, Marin said. The doctor looked at her, and there was no anger in that gaze. No pity, only the weariness of someone who had heard the sentence too many times in her career to be surprised by it anymore. She wrote something on a sheet of paper, folded it, and handed it to Marin. "I know you won't rest," she said, "but I still have to write this. Take it." At 4:40 in the morning, no one offered to call a taxi, and Marin didn't ask. She caught the number 30 bus at the corner, after waiting 17 minutes beneath a cracked plastic shelter. The snow had stopped, and now only the cold remained, the dry cold of a Chicago February, the kind that worked its way into the bones, instead of resting on the skin. There were only 4 people on the bus, all of them returning home from some night shift, all of them nodding off, and none of them looking at anyone else. The apartment in Bridgeport had 1 room, a kitchen built into the wall, and a single window facing the brick wall of the building next door. Marin didn't turn on the main light. She took off her apron, carried it to the sink, and opened the faucet. Water ran from the fabric into the basin, and it was red, so red that for the first half-second she had to look away. Then it faded to pink, then pale pink, then clear. She scrubbed it, rinsed it, scrubbed it again, without soap because there was only a little soap left, and she was trying to make it last until Friday. The final water ran perfectly clear, and she wrung out the apron with both hands, wrung it hard, twisting it like a length of rope, then hung it from the handle of the oven door. It would be dry by afternoon. She would wear it to work that evening. She only had one. They didn't issue a second apron, and a new one at the uniform shop on Halsted Street cost $22. And $22 was the cost of 2 examinations she couldn't afford to attend. She sat on the edge of the bed. Beyond the window, the brick wall was beginning to change from black to gray. She took off her shoes, and her feet were so swollen that it took some time to pull them free. She placed one hand on her belly, where for the past several weeks there had been small, firm, steady kicks, like someone knocking on a door from the inside. "I'm sorry, baby," she said. "Tonight was a little long. At 2:10 in the morning, 21 minutes before Marin Delaney walked down the corridor at Mercy Southside Hospital, and a hand came up across her chest to stop her. Gideon Pike was still kneeling on the concrete floor of Warehouse D with one shoulder braced beneath the steel beam, and he was counting. He counted because the girl had told him to count. He lifted it exactly one handspan, just as she had instructed, no higher, and when the beams shifted upward, something slid out from beneath the edge of the pallet. It moved the way only small hay objects moved, not rolling but dragging itself forward in one short, abrupt motion before stopping. Gideon looked down. It lay about one handspan from his knee, beneath the pallet's shadow, in precisely the sort of place no one standing upright and looking down would ever see. A cable cutting knife. The kind with a hook tip, a black rubber handle, and a short blade curved like a claw, the sort of tool everyone in the harbor kept in a toolbox and no one ever noticed. But that knife wasn't inside anyone's toolbox. It was lying beneath a row of shelving that had just collapsed, and Gideon Pike had walked through Warehouse D at 11 o'clock that night, as he did every night, shining his flashlight down every aisle, as he did every night, and he knew that floor had been clean at 11 o'clock. He had spent 34 years looking at wreckage, and he knew the difference between something shaken loose by an accident and something dropped by a person running away. He said nothing. He didn't call out to the girl. The girl was busy keeping a man from dying, and she was doing it while 7 months pregnant, and Gideon decided very quickly, more quickly than he had imagined he was still capable of deciding at 58, that she didn't need one more thing to carry. He lowered the beam when she told him to. He helped her pull the man another 40 centimeters free. Then, when she turned away to reach for the phone, Gideon Pike lowered 2 fingers, picked up the knife by the edge of its handle, and slipped it into his coat pocket. He didn't wipe it clean. He didn't look at it again. The ambulance arrived. Red lights swept across the container yard. They carried Mr. Rourke away, and the girl followed, and before she climbed into the ambulance, Gideon told her, "Go on, child. I'll stay and call the office." Those were the last words he spoke to anyone that night. He didn't call the office right away. He walked back to the security booth at Gate 3, a trip that took 4 minutes, and along the way he didn't turn into the break room, didn't stop at the restroom, and didn't pause anywhere. He entered the booth, opened the cabinet beneath the desk, and took out a green steel toolbox with paint chipped from all 4 corners, the box he had carried with him for 30 years and that no one had ever asked to look inside. He opened the lid. He placed the knife at the very bottom, beneath the roll of duct tape, the wrench, and several spare hinges. He closed the lid. He pushed the box back into the cabinet. Then he poured coffee from a pot that had been cold since midnight, sat down in his chair, and waited. At 5 minutes before 3, a car turned through Gate 3. Everett Vance stepped out, 46 years old, wearing a blue wool coat and leather gloves, and Gideon noticed that he didn't remove the gloves even when he entered the Gore Code. He didn't stop at the booth. He didn't ask Gideon a single question. He didn't ask whether anyone had been hurt, how Mr. Rourke was doing, or which hospital they had taken him to. He went straight into Warehouse D on the security monitor in front of Gideon. Section D was a black square, but Gideon could see the gray rolling door with his own eyes through the booth's glass, about 70 meters away, and Vance's flashlight began moving inside like a firefly trapped in a shoebox. It moved for 40 minutes. Gideon finished the cold coffee. He poured himself a second cup. He sat perfectly still and watched that spot of light back and forth, lowering itself, stopping, then continuing. It didn't move the way people moved when searching for an injured man. When people searched for someone, they called out the person's name. That spot of light called out nothing. It traveled slowly and carefully along the base of the shelving, one row after another, and returned to the same place 3 times. At one point, it remained motionless for a very long time in the exact place where the pallet had fallen, and Gideon watched that still point of light and felt something very old stir inside his chest, something he had buried so deeply that he had believed it was dead. Then the light moved toward the exit. A Vance came through the rolling door at 3:38. He stood in the yard for a while with both hands on his hips, breathing a white cloud into the frozen air. Then he walked toward the security booth. He stopped outside the glass door. He looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back, both hands wrapped around his coffee cup, his face revealing nothing at all. the face of an old man nearing the end of his shift and thinking about breakfast. "Did you go in there?" Vance asked. Gideon shook his head only once. Vance watched him for 3 seconds. Then he nodded, banked into his car, and drove through gate 3 at 3:42. Gideon Pike didn't say a single word. He remained there alone beneath the fluorescent light, and he didn't stand, and he didn't call anyone. 30 years earlier, he had been a firefighter at Station 21, and he had opened his mouth exactly once. He had reported his commanding officer over several air tanks whose inspections had expired. Gideon had been right. The paperwork proved he was right. But he was the only man in that room who had no one standing behind him, and 6 months later he was no longer a firefighter, while the commander retired with a full pension and a farewell party with cake. From that day forward, Gideon Pike learned something. He never spoke aloud to anyone. When men like him opened their mouths, people didn't believe them. So he stopped opening his mouth. He only wrote things down. He wrote by hand, recording everything, every arrival, every departure, every time, every license plate, for 6 straight years, in a paper notebook no one had ever asked to see. And he kept it. He kept it until someone was willing to look him in the face. Sloane Rourke arrived at the harbor at 7:15 in the morning, wearing low-heeled shoes because she knew she would have to step over steel. And she didn't ask a single question about her younger brother before asking about the warehouse. That was the first thing everyone present that day noticed, and no one dared say it aloud. She stood in the middle of Warehouse D for 30 minutes without touching anything, only looking, while 3 men waited behind her. At 7:45, the systems technician gave his report. The cameras in Section D and in the connection corridor had been erased from 1:25 to 2:05 in the morning. 40 minutes, not malfunctioning, not a power failure, erased. The access card logs from that same period were also blank, wiped perfectly clean, as though not a single door in the building had been opened during those 40 minutes. Sloane asked who had authorization to erase them. The technician said there were 4 accounts. She asked which account had done it. He said it couldn't be determined because the log recording who performed the deletion had also been erased. Sloane said nothing. By 8:30, the inventory team had finished. Warehouse D was supposed to contain 42 pallets. 41 remained. The missing one was pallet number 40. Declared customs value, $2,300,000. Sloane heard the figure, and not a single feature on her face changed. Yet the man giving the report suddenly felt a crawl down his spine even though he was standing inside a heated warehouse. Everett Vance spoke first. He always spoke first, and he always used the kind of voice no one wanted to argue with. The voice of a man helping you see something you should have seen for yourself, if only you had been a little calmer. He said, "I don't like this, Sloane. I truly don't like it. But there's something we have to say aloud. The restaurant's back door is exactly 40 meters from the rolling door of Warehouse D. I measured it. 40 meters, 1 yard, and no camera that's out of parents coincident asking wisdom were positioned town checkers, not the trash bins. She goes in and out of that yard all night, every night, and she has for 6 years. Taking out garbage, smoking, making phone calls, and no one knows. No one records it. No one counts waitresses. He stopped at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right place, and let the silence do the work for him. And within that silence, Sloane Rourke tilted her head slightly for the first time that morning. At 9:15, someone called Marin Delaney. She had slept for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The conference room on the 7th floor of the Rourke Holdings building had 3 walls of glass overlooking Lake Michigan, gray as steel, and the table in the center was so long that the people seated at opposite ends had to speak more loudly than usual. They left Marin standing. No one told her to stand. It was only that no one pulled out a chair, and she didn't pull one out for herself, because she had learned at 23 that in rooms like this, people like her didn't pull out their own chairs. So she stood with both hands resting in front of her belly, wearing her work uniform because her apron was still wet on the oven door at home, and they questioned her. How many times had she gone into the yard during her shift? Had she ever entered Section D? Did she know the door code? Did she know anyone in the warehouse division? Had she ever accepted cash from a customer without entering it into the register? That question had nothing to do with pallet number 40, and she knew it had nothing to do with it. But she answered anyway. "No, Mom. Everything goes through the register." They asked where she had been at 1:20 in the morning. In the kitchen. Who had seen her? The cook. What was the cook's name? She gave the name. They wrote it down. Where had she been at 1:40? Still in the kitchen. Who had seen her? No one. By then, I was the only one left. They wrote that down more slowly. 40 minutes. She stood for 40 minutes. Her feet were swollen from the night before. The sweater she wore had begun to cling to her back, and the tightening in her belly returned, once, then twice, and she placed a hand there, breathed through it, and said nothing. At the 41st minute, Sloane Rourke pushed a chair out with the toe of her shoe. "Sit down," she said. Marin looked at her. "Don't misunderstand me," Sloane said without lifting her eyes from the papers. "If you faint in here, this entire session becomes useless, and I have to start over tomorrow. I don't have tomorrow." "Sit," Marin sat. 3 hours. The questions circled back, repeated in different words. The same question wearing 3 different sets of clothing. And Marin gave the same answer 3 times because it was the truth, and the truth didn't have 3 versions. "Near noon," Vance said. "That's enough. I think we've troubled Miss Delaney long enough." His voice warm, almost kind, and he opened the door for her with a courtesy that made her feel more nauseated than the previous 3 hours had. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the owner of the Longshore room called. His name was Dale. He was 63. He had hired her 6 years earlier when no one else would hire a girl who had left school before finishing, and his voice trembled when he spoke. He said, "Take some time off, child. Just temporarily until this passes." He said there would be no pay, and asked her to understand because he didn't have the funds to pay someone who wasn't working a shift. Then he fell silent for a long time, and Marin heard the thing he didn't say, the thing everyone in the harbor knew and no one named. The Longshore room didn't belong to Dale. Dale only leased the space. That space belonged to Rourke Holdings, and it always had, and a tenant didn't argue with his landlord, even if he was 63, and even if he knew perfectly well that this girl had never taken a single cent from anyone. Marin set the phone down on the kitchen table. All her life, she had heard that sentence. No one counts waitresses. She had heard it when people discussed business directly in front of her, as though she were a wall lamp. She had heard it when people left $2 on an $80 check. She had heard it for 6 years in every possible way people could say something without opening their mouths. This was the first time anyone had used it to accuse her. 3 days later, Marin Delaney walked 11 blocks to the community clinic on Ashland Street. Carrying the sheet of paper the young doctor at Mercy's South Side had folded and handed to her at 4 o'clock that morning. The paper she hadn't thrown away, even though she knew she wasn't going to rest. She didn't go because of the paper. She went because the tightening had come 4 more times over the past 3 days, because she had awakened at 3 o'clock the previous morning with a thought she wouldn't allow herself to finish, and because Perpetua Doyle had once told her only one thing about pregnancy, that your body speaks to you before it screams, and the price of refusing to listen is that one day you'll hear the scream. The clinic opened at 9 o'clock, and by 9:15 there were already 14 people waiting. Marin took number 41. She waited for 2 hours and 40 minutes on an orange black chair beside an elderly woman dozing with a grocery bag full of medicine bottles in her lap. And when her turn came, the person at the reception desk wasn't a doctor, but a girl of about 25, wearing a headset over one ear and typing very quickly. The girl asked about insurance. Marin said she didn't have any. The girl typed for a little longer without looking up, then said that without insurance, an ultrasound cost $340. She said it in the tone pool used to read out the price of gasoline. There was nothing cruel in it. It was only a number, and that girl read 200 numbers like it every day, and none of them was her fault. Marin opened her wallet. She did it slowly, and she did it openly, right there on the counter, because something inside her had run out of the ability to pretend over the past few days. She took out the money and counted it. Tip money was always the same, a fistful of crumpled $1 bills, a few fives, and once in a while a 20, money that had passed through too many hands and spilled kitchen grease and trouser pockets. She counted twice because her hands shook the first time. $212. She gathered the bills into a stack, folded them in half, and returned them to her wallet. "Thank you," she said. The girl at the counter looked up for the first time. She opened her mouth as though she meant to say something. Marin had already turned away. In the parking lot, wind from the lake swept between the 2 buildings, carrying a sharp cold that made people's eyes sting without tears. Maren stood beside a car that wasn't hers with one hand resting on the freezing hood, and she stayed there for about 4 minutes. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried at the hospital, hadn't cried in the glass conference room, hadn't cried when Mr. Dale called with the trembling voice of a 63-year-old man, apologizing for something that wasn't his fault. She stood there and did what she had been doing for the past 6 months, something no one had taught her but at which she had become very skilled. She rearranged everything. Another $128. If she went back to work next week, though she wouldn't be going back next week. If she sold the ring, though the ring was only worth $60, she had already asked in November when the gas bill rose. If. She rearranged the numbers until they lay still, then lifted her hand from the hood and walked the 11 blocks home. The apartment was cold because she had turned off the heat before leaving. She didn't switch it back on right away. She took off her coat, hung it up, and stood between the kitchen built into the wall and the rest of the room, realizing she hadn't eaten since the previous night, and that this now was no longer something that belonged only to her. So she opened the refrigerator. Inside were 3 eggs left in a carton, a jar of mustard, half a loaf of bread, and a container of milk that had expired the week before but that she still hadn't thrown away because she kept thinking she might cook something with it. She lifted the milk out to reach for the eggs, and on the lowest shelf, behind the place where the milk had been standing, was a small white cardboard box tied with string, about the size of 2 cupped hands. Inside was a cake, the smallest kind sold at the bakery on Halsted Street, covered in white frosting, with 3 words written across the top in pink icing that had now darkened to brown. 3 words she had once stood at the bakery counter and asked someone to write for her, write it for him. He's going to be a father. Rowan was supposed to come home at 7 o'clock that evening. She had planned to wait until after he had eaten. The police knocked on the door at 6:40. Maren closed the refrigerator. She stood there, with one hand still resting on the door, and beyond the window, the brick wall of the neighboring building remained as still as it had always been. Then she opened the refrigerator again, placed the expired milk back in exactly the same spot, the place where it had stood for 6 months, and closed the door. She had never thrown it away. Cormac Rourke gained consciousness after 36 hours, and within 4 minutes of opening his eyes, he had pulled the intravenous needle from the back of his hand and sat up. The nurse on duty rushed in and told him he wasn't allowed to sit up, that he had lost nearly 1/3 of the blood in his body, and needed to remain in bed for at least another 48 hours. He looked at her and said thank you in the perfectly courteous voice of a man who had listened to every word and had no intention of obeying. And the nurse stood there for 3 seconds before leaving to call the doctor. And by the time the doctor arrived, there were already 3 men in suits inside the room and an open laptop on the patient's meal table. By noon, room number 412 at Mercy Southside Hospital was no longer a hospital room. It was an office. Sloane Rourke sat in the corner with a stack of papers on her lap, and she had given up telling her younger brother to lie down sometime around 10 o'clock. At 2 o'clock into the afternoon, they brought in a man named Barrett, a man in his 50s who owned a plumbing supply store in South Deering and had owed $12,000 since October. He stood at the foot of the bed with both hands clasped in front of his stomach, holding his hat even though the room was warm, and he began speaking immediately, speaking quickly, the way people spoke when they had rehearsed every word in the car all the way there. Mr. Rourke, I know it's late, I know, but the suppliers raised their prices this month, and I have 3 outstanding invoices that haven't been paid yet. I have the paperwork here. I brought all of it. Sit down, Cormac said. Mr. Barrett stopped in the middle of his sentence. Sit down, I'm injured. You standing there is making my neck tired. The man sat in the plastic chair beside the bed. He was still holding his hat. Cormac didn't look at the stack of papers. He reached for a single sheet from the patient's meal table and slid it across the surface toward Mr. Barrett with 2 fingers, slowly, as though moving a chess piece. Sign it, he said. You keep the store. I keep 40%. Mr. Barrett stared at the paper. His lips moved without sound. Mr. Rourke, that store belonged to my father. I know I rented the file, then you know that. You have 1 store, Cormac said. I have 7. Do you know the difference? Mr. Barrett didn't answer. It isn't that 7 is more than 1, Cormac said. He spoke gently, almost as though explaining something to a man toward whom he felt genuine goodwill. The difference is that I don't need any of those 7. I could burn all 7 tomorrow morning, and on Monday I would still go to work as usual. What I need isn't your store, Mr. Barrett. What I need is for people to understand that when I say 1 hour, I mean 1 hour. For the past 4 months, you have taught certain people that when I say 1 hour, it might mean 4 months. That costs far more than $12,000. At 40%, I'm giving you a bargain. Mr. Barrett picked up the pen. His hand trembled so badly that the first stroke slipped below the line, and he had to sign again underneath. He pushed the paper back. He remained seated for another 2 seconds, perhaps waiting for something, a word of thanks, a handshake, anything he could carry home with him. Cormac had already turned toward Sloane. "The contract in Gary," he said. "Have they responded yet?" Mr. Barrett stood, put on his hat, and left. No one watched him go. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Sloane began presenting the situation at the harbor. She had been speaking for 4 minutes when Cormac interrupted her. "Close the harbor," he said. Sloane looked up. There were 4 people in the room, and all 4 had heard him. No one moved. "Cormac," she said, "there are 42 containers waiting to be unloaded. 3 of them are refrigerated cargo, and if they aren't handled by the end of today, they'll be ruined. The transport companies have had trucks scheduled since Tuesday. Customs has already close the harbor." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't repeat himself a 3rd time. He only said those 3 words, then reached for the glass of water on the table and took a sip, and the simple act of drinking made it clearer than anything else in the room that the discussion was over. Sloane watched her younger brother for a long moment. Then she took out her phone and made 3 calls. At 4:20 that afternoon, gates 1, 2, and 3 of Calumet Harbor closed. 42 containers stood motionless in the yard. 3 tractor trailers that had already arrived were forced to turn around, and all 3 drivers sat in their cabs calling their companies, unable to understand what was happening. 327 dock workers, forklift drivers, inventory clerks, and administrative employees received messages telling them not to report to work without pay until further notice. Among them was a man making payments on his car, someone who had only gotten the job the week before, and a mother of 2 who worked the day shift at the gate, 2 counting booth, and would lose exactly $148 she had already set aside for that month's electric bill. Cormac Rourke didn't ask about that number. He didn't ask how many people there were. He didn't ask how much the 3 refrigerated containers were worth. He sat in the hospital bed with a small spot of blood seeping through the bandage on his right thigh, looking out the window toward the lake, and he didn't ask because in his mind, that question had never existed. He only said, "When I get out of here, I want the complete list of everyone with access cards to Section D reviewed again. Every single person. No exceptions." That evening, after room 412 had emptied and only Sloane remained, gathering papers into her briefcase, Cormac Rourke asked the question he had kept behind his teeth all day. "Who tied off my leg?" Sloane stopped moving. She had been waiting for that question since morning, and he had prepared 3 different answers, but in the end she chose the shortest one. "The waitress from the longshore," she said. "Delaney. We think she took pallet number 40. She continued in an even, professional voice, explaining the 40 meters of yard without camera coverage, the restaurant's rear door, the fact that no one logged the movements of people carrying out trash, and while she spoke, Cormac didn't look at her. He watched the trail of light from some distant ship crawling slowly across the black surface of the lake beyond the window. Sloane finished. She waited. He remained silent for a very long time, long enough that Sloane began to think he had fallen asleep. Then he said, "Did you listen to the emergency call recording?" Sloane said yes. She gave the time, Cormac said, 1:52. She said it twice and told the dispatcher to write it down. He turned his head and looked at his sister. "Someone stealing $2,300,000 doesn't stop to record the time a tourniquet was applied, Sloane. Someone stealing $2,300,000 runs. And even if she did stop, she wouldn't willingly put her name, her address, and her phone number into a recording that anyone in the United States could obtain within 2 hours." Sloane said, "Or she's clever." "No one is that clever at 2 o'clock in the morning," Cormac said. "No one. People are clever at 3 o'clock in the afternoon inside conference rooms. At 2 o'clock in the morning, people are only themselves." Sloane closed the briefcase. Fine, she said. Then answer one question for me. What were you doing in Warehouse D at 1 o'clock in the morning? The heart monitor continued its steady beeping. In the corridors outside, a medication cart rolled past. Cormac Rourke looked at his sister and said nothing. Sloane waited 10 seconds. Then she picked up her briefcase and walked out, and she didn't slam the door because in all 39 years of her life she had never slammed a door. But Cormac understood perfectly well what the manner of her leaving meant. 4 days later, he left the hospital 11 days ahead of schedule, and the black car stopped in front of a 4-story building in Bridgeport at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The snow had melted into dirty water along the curb. Sloane said one final time, "You don't need to go up. Send someone else." Cormac opened the car door and stepped out, used the cane for exactly the first 4 steps, then placed it in the driver's hand, and climbed 3 flights of stairs in a building without an elevator, while the bandage on his right thigh was still seeping. Sloane followed behind him without saying anything, because she had learned when he was 19 that there were moments when her younger brother could no longer hear anyone. He knocked on the door, 3 times, without hurry. The door opened exactly halfway, as far as the security chain allowed. Marin Delaney stood behind it. She wore a gray sweater, her hair tied at the nape of her neck, and in the yellow light from the ceiling's fixtures inside the apartment spilling into the dark hallway, Cormac Rourke saw the 7-month curve of her belly. He hadn't known. No one had told him. In everything Sloane had reported about this woman, in everything entered into the record, in the 3 hours inside that glass conference room, not one line had mentioned that she was pregnant, because no one had considered it relevant to pallet number 40. Cormac stood there with the words he had prepared in his mind for 4 days, and for half a second, all of them vanished. He held an envelope in his hand. He didn't offer it right away. "Miss Delaney," he said. She said nothing. She looked at him and then passed his shoulder at Sloane, then back at him. "I pay in full for everything I take," Cormac said. "That's how I live. That night, I took 1 night from you and 1 apron. I came to repay you." "You didn't take anything," Marin said. "I gave it." Cormac tilted his head slightly. "No one gives anything for nothing, Miss Delaney. Then you haven't met enough people." She didn't raise her voice when she said it. There was no sarcasm and not a grain of bitterness in it. She said it as though reading the weather forecast. That was what made him stand perfectly still. The door closed. The chain slid into place, and the lock turned with a single click. Cormac Rourke stood in front of a peeling brown-painted plywood door on the 3rd floor of a building Bridgeport on, still holding the envelope in his hand. 34 years old, 7 stores, 1 harbor, 200 people on his payroll, and in all those 34 years, no door had ever been closed in his face. People opened doors for him. People stood when he entered. People signed when he pushed papers across a table. "Let's go," Sloane said. He didn't move. "Cormac, did you see that belly?" he said. Sloane didn't answer. He kept looking at the door. "She knelt in my blood," he said, "on a concrete floor, at 2 o'clock in the morning, with that belly." Then he turned and started down the stairs, and at the 9th step, he had to stop for a moment and place 1 hand on the railing. Sloane said nothing, and neither did he nor Halloran, whom everyone at the harbor had called Winnie since some time in the 1990s, for so long that even she had nearly forgotten her given name, appeared at the 3rd-floor apartment door the next morning at 9 o'clock, carrying a paper bag with egg sandwiches in one hand and her car keys in the other. She didn't knock. She pounded on the door 3 times, the way a person pounded when she was 61 years old and had managed the night shift at a harbor restaurant for 22 years. "Put on your coat," she said. Marin said she didn't have any money. Winnie said, "Did I ask you that?" Marin said, "Miss Winnie." Winnie said, "Put on your coat, child," at the clinic on Ashland Street. She walked straight to the counter, placed her card on the surface, and said, $340, run it. The girl wearing a headset over one ear looked up, looked at Winnie, looked at Marin standing behind her, then ran the card. Marin said, "Miss Winnie." "No, you can't. I can't let you." Winnie didn't turn around. "Take it out of your wages," she said, later. They both knew it was a lie. Marin no longer had wages from which anything could be deducted. Winnie had signed the unpaid leave notice with her own hand because Mr. Dale had been shaking too badly to hold the pen. But that sentence was a door, and Winnie opened it just wide enough for this young woman to walk through without lowering her head. and Marin walked through because there were times when accepting was the only way not to insult the person who was giving. They sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes. The elderly woman with the plastic bag full of medicine bottles was sitting in the same chair as before, and once again she was nodding off. On the wall was the vaccinations poster faded at the upper right corner. Winnie opened the paper bag, handed Marin the sandwich, and watched until she took the first bite. Then she said, "Child." Marin looked up. "I've been doing this work for 22 years. I've seen every kind of person pass through that kitchen. You know I've never asked you about anything, don't you?" Marin nodded. "That night," Winnie said. "The tourniquet, the strap and the ladle handle. Gideon told me about it. He told it 3 times, and every time he shook his head." Marin looked down at the sandwich. "Child," Winnie said, "why didn't you become a nurse?" The air conditioner hummed in the waiting room, and somewhere across the room, a small child giggled with his mother. Marin didn't answer for a long time, and Winnie didn't rush her because Winnie was 61 years old and knew the price of rushing someone. "I was 1 semester short," Marin said. Winnie said nothing. "Malcolm X College," Marin said. "The nursing program. I studied for 2 years. I had 1 semester left, 16 credits. I had already registered, already paid the deposit, already bought the books. I still have the white lab coat they made us buy in the first year. I've never worn it once." Winnie remained silent. "Then Perpetua fell in the bathroom," Marin said. "In September. They did the scans and said it was cancer stage 4 already in her bones. She was 74 years old, and she lived alone because she refused to stay with anyone. I was the only person she had left." Winnie eared straight ahead. "If I stayed in school," Marin said, "I had 3 hospital clinical shifts every week, 12 hours each, unpaid, plus classes, plus working to pay the rent. I sat at the kitchen table and took out paper and calculated everything. I calculated all night. There was no way. There wasn't a single way I could stay in school and still be there for her at home." She took another very small bite of the sandwich, then set it down. "So I quit. I called the school office on September 11th and told them I wanted to defer. And the woman in the office said the maximum deferral was strictly limited, and after a year I would have to start over from the beginning. I said, 'Yes, Mom, I understand.' I hung up. I took the bus to her house and made soup." "How long did she live?" Winnie asked. 4 months, Marin said. The 2 women sat in silence. The child across the room laughed again. "Did she know you left school?" Winnie asked. "No," Marin said. "Told her I had switched to eating. She believed me. She's 74 years old and taking pain medicine, so she believed me. One day she held my hand and said, 'You're going to be a nurse soon, so very soon.'" She picked up the sandwich, then set it down again. "When the deferral finally expired," Marin said, "I didn't call back. By then, I had been waiting tables for 8 months, and I had grown used to having money come in on Fridays." Winnie Halloran, 22 years in the business. The woman who had fired 14 people and had never cried in front of anyone in that restaurant sat on the orange plastic chair and stared at the faded vaccination poster. And she didn't turn her head, and she raised a hand to the corner of her eye with the motion of someone brushing away a strand of hair. That afternoon, Marin went home alone. The apartment was cold, and she didn't turn on the heat. She lowered herself to her knees with difficulty, leaning to one side, and pulled a cardboard box from beneath the bed, the box she hadn't opened since before the funeral. Inside were an old expired driver's license, a Malcolm X College student card, with a photograph of a smiling younger version of herself, several of Perpetua's hospital bills that Marin had kept, even though they had all been paid, a rosary, and a white lab coat folded neatly inside, a plastic bag that had never been opened. And at the very bottom, beneath all of those things, was a small green hardcover notebook, about the size of her hand, its edges worn, the kind of notebook new employees at the Longshore Room were given for writing down orders when the system went down. Her first one, 6 years earlier. Marin picked it up, brushed the dust from the cover, and placed it on the edge of the bed. The green notebook lay on the edge of the bed for 2 hours before Marin nudged it again, and when she did, it wasn't because she was looking for anything, but because night had fallen. She didn't want to turn on the main light, and she needed something to hold in her hands. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting belonged to a much younger version of herself, rounder, slower, each word formed carefully as though she were afraid of making a mistake. Table 4, 2 medium rare steaks, 1 without onions. Table 7, soup coffee. She turned the page, then another, and somewhere near the middle of the notebook, She recognized something she had been doing for 6 years without ever giving it a name. She hadn't only written down orders. She had written down people. In the margins, in smaller letters squeezed into empty spaces, she had recorded the things that helped her remember the customers. The man with the silver beard hates ice in his water. The red-haired woman always asks whether the bread is warm. The 2 men at table 9 never sit with their backs to the door. She wrote because memory was the only tool a waitress had. Because when a customer returned a second time and she remembered how he took his coffee, the tip changed. And because of the bitter lesson she had learned at her previous job, when she was falsely accused of a theft she had nothing to do with. From that day forward, she knew that people like her had to become their own evidence, because no one else would do it for them. She set the green notebook down, stood, and went to the drawer beneath the sink where she kept her current notebook, the 11th one, the notebook for that month. She turned to that night. 1:15 in the morning, table 6, 1 black coffee, no food. Sat for 25 minutes, paid cash, $9 for a $4 cup, didn't wait for change. No tip, because change wasn't a tip. Change was what people left when they didn't want to stand there waiting. And in the margin, in her own hurried, slanting handwriting, were 3 short lines. Blue coat, leather gloves, didn't remove gloves to hold the cup. Marin sat perfectly still. She had served coffee to roughly 40,000 people in 6 years. People removed their gloves. Everyone removed their gloves. They came in from 10 degrees below zero, sat down. The first thing they did was take off their gloves, because holding a hot cup through thick leather made no sense at all. People drank hot coffee at 2 o'clock in the morning, precisely so they could feel that heat in their palms. She had written the line because it had seemed strange at the time. She had recorded it by instinct, the way she recorded everything strange. And then 2 minutes later she had forgotten it and gone to serve another table. No one drank hot coffee without removing their gloves, unless they didn't intend to leave fingerprints. She placed her hand on the page and sat in the darkness for a very long time. And then she began turning backward, slowly, 1 page at a time. And that was when something larger began opening before her, like a door she had walked through every night for 6 years without ever seeing it. Table 6 was in the farthest corner, hidden from view, invisible from the windows, and invisible from the counter. It was the only table in the restaurant with its own light and no music speaker overhead. She had served Old 6 for 6 years. She knew who sat there. She knew how long they stayed, whom they sat with, who arrived first, who left first, who paid. Table 6. July, 2 men. One of them placed his leather briefcase on the chair instead of the floor. Table 6, November, 3 men. The third ordered nothing, only sat. The longshore room had been open for decades. Mr. Dale wasn't the owner. Mr. Dale leased the space, and the space belonged to Rourke Holdings. And that restaurant had been built by Fergus Rourke, Cormac's father, not to sell steaks. It had been built to provide a place to sit 200 meters from the harbor gate, open until 3 o'clock in the morning, where 2 men could talk for 40 minutes without anyone hearing. And waitresses were hired there according to one standard, a standard that had never appeared in any job posting, but that anyone who worked there for 3 months understood. Don't ask questions. I've been in that room, Marin thought, for 6 years. She had stood 1 meter away from them. She poured water, cleared plates, asked whether they needed anything else, and they continued speaking as though she were a wall lamp, as though she were a heater, as though she were a piece of furniture that could move. No one lowered his voice when she approached the table. No one changed the subject, because in their minds, she wasn't in the room, and she had heard everything, and she had written it down. Not the content. She had never written a single sentence they spoke and had never thought of doing so. She had written something else. She had written who. She had written when. She had written how long. She had written who sat with whom on which night, and which nights they no longer sat together, and in which month a new name began airing at table 6 while an old one stopped. 11 notebooks. 6 years. Every important meeting at this harbor, recorded by hand in ink that didn't smear, by a persons no one remembered seeing. Her notebook wasn't an alibi. It was a chronicle of the entire Calumet Harbor. And sitting in the dark third-floor apartment in Bridgeport, with her hand resting on the page that held 3 lines about a pair of leather gloves, Marin Delaney understood why someone needed her silenced. Not because they believed she had taken pallet number 40, but because if she were accused, then those 11 notebooks would become the testimony of a thief. And no one read the testimony of a thief. She straightened and released a long breath. On the wrist of the man beneath the fallen steel that night was an anchor and 3 numbers. 1, 4, 7. It was the number of a Rourke Holdings crane crew, the numbermen tattooed on their arms during their first year of work and never removed. Rowan linked to crew 147. Cormac Rourke had 2 from the age of 18 before he owned the harbor. She had known who he was from the very first second, and she had still twisted the tourniquet 1 turn tighter. She pulled all 11 notebooks from the drawer and the box beneath the bed, arranged them in a row across the floor in order, then lowered herself between them, with her back resting against the bed frame, and began to search. She wasn't searching for pallet number 40. She had stopped thinking about pallet number 40 about an hour earlier. She was searching for a specific night. The night 3 weeks before the evening when the police knocked on her door at 6:40. She searched for it because something had begun moving inside her mind from the moment she saw those 3 lines about the leather gloves. Something she still couldn't name, only that if table number 6 had recorded all 6 years of the harbor, then it must also have recorded the 3 weeks before her husband died. The 10th notebook. Its cover was a darker shade of blue, and the upper edge had curled from being carried too long inside her apron pocket. She turned the pages, the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, a page and a half, a busy night, some kind of celebration among the dock workers at table 2, the 13th. She stopped. She turned back 1 page, the 11th, forward again, the 13th. She turned back once more slowly this time, and slid 1 finger into the spine. A strip of paper was still attached, about half a centimeter, raggedly torn, the kind of tear left when paper was ripped by hand rather than sliced with a utility knife, torn quickly in 1 sharp pull. She brought the notebook closer to the light. On the remaining strip of paper, on the 3rd line from the top, a piece of ink had survived the tear. A curved stroke, half a stem, the foot of a letter. The letter R. Maren Delaney sat on the cold floor, with the notebook in her hands, turning forward, backward, and her hands began to shake, and she couldn't make them stop. She held the notebook beneath the light and peered into the spine. She turned to the page for the 13th, and pressed her finger against the paper, searching for the indentation left by the pen on the missing page. The sort of trick people always saw in movies. But there was nothing, because the page for the 12th hadn't rested directly against the page for the 13th. Between them had been the reverse side of the sheet someone had torn away. She turned back once more. The R was still there. She hadn't torn it out. In 6 years, she had never torn out a single page. She didn't tear pages even when she made mistakes. She crossed the words out and wrote the correction beneath them, because Perpetua had once told her something one distant afternoon in the kitchen, that when you cross something out, people can still read it, but when you tear it away, people will ask what you were trying to hide. Maren had carried those words with her all her life. She didn't tear pages. She never had. Someone had picked up her notebook and torn out an entire day. It took her 4 minutes to get to her feet. Then she put on her coat. At 9 o'clock that night, the security booth at Gate 3 glowed beneath fluorescent light, and Gideon Pike was sitting with his 4th cup of coffee of the shift when the glass door opened. He looked up, saw who was standing there, and rose too quickly for his knees. Maren placed the notebook on the desk. "Mr. Pike," she said, "I need you to help me with something." He didn't ask what. He only looked at the notebook, then at her, then pulled open the cabinet beneath the desk. He didn't take out the steel toolbox. He took out what lay beside it. A large notebook with a black hardcover, 3 times thicker than Maren's, its spine repaired twice with tape. He placed it on the desk, opened it, and turned the pages. She looked and she saw 6 years, every departure, every arrival, hour, minute, name, license plate, gate, authorization. Written by hand, line after line, not a single night missing. "I need the log for that night," she said. Gideon turned to it. He lowered 1 finger to the page, traced down the entries, stopped, and said nothing. He rotated the notebook toward her. She read it. She read it a 2nd time, then she looked up at him. "Why did you record all of this?" she asked. 6 years. "I record things," Gideon Pike said. "Don't ask why." That was all he said. Then he turned farther ahead, toward the end of the notebook, to the night neither of them needed to name. He stopped at the line marked 152 and pointed to it with the thick fingernail of a man who had worked with his hands for 40 years. In the Rourke Holdings computer system, the card swipe at 1:52 didn't exist. It had been erased along with 40 minutes of camera footage and the log identifying who had erased it. 3 technicians had spent 3 days examining the system, and all they had been able to tell Sloane Rourke was that the empty space had been wiped perfectly clean. But in this black-covered notebook on the 17th line from the top, written in blue ballpoint ink, there was a time, a gate, and a card code. Human Resources backup card number 2. Marin stared at the code. She didn't understand what it meant. Gideon Pike understood since that night, and he had sat with that knowledge for 11 days inside this security booth without telling anyone. That card, he said, is kept in the safe in Human Resources. That safe has one key. He closed the notebook. Everett Vance keeps it. The next morning, Cormac Rourke made a phone call that lasted exactly 40 seconds. He said, "I want someone near Miss Delaney in Bridgeport until I tell you to stop." He said, "Don't let her see you. She'll be uncomfortable." He said, "Report back to me every evening." Then he ended the call and returned to the list of access cards for Section D, which he had read through page 9 during the night. And he didn't think about that call for another second, because in his world, when he spoke a sentence, that sentence carried itself out. He had assigned someone. That person had a name, a file, 11 years of service, and a direct supervisor as Cormac had never paid attention to, because among 200 names on his payroll, who reported to whom was a matter for Human Resources. Not for him. The man he had assigned belonged to Everett Vance, sitting in room 412, with the bandage on his thigh changed for the 4th time. Cormac Rourke had just personally handed the man, who had cut the cable, an address and a schedule. At 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, Winnie Halloran parked behind the clinic on Ashland Street and remained in the car because she hated the smell of clinics, while Marin came out alone, holding a black and white sheet of paper printed with something that, from a distance, looked like nothing more than a patch of fog. She took 7 steps. 2 men rose from the hood of a gray car. They didn't run toward her. That was what frightened her. When people ran toward you, at least you understood what was happening. These 2 only stood and walked, slowly, separating to either side, the way people walked when they had done this many times and knew there was no need to hurry. One of them said, "Miss Delaney, Mr. Vance would like to speak with you." The other said nothing. He only moved around behind her, and that movement behind her was the answer. Marin Delaney was 31 weeks pregnant. She wasn't tall. She wasn't strong. She had slept a total of 9 hours in 4 days. She didn't fight back, and she didn't scream, because screaming wasted breath, and she was going to need her breath. She ran. She ran the way a woman 7 months pregnant ran, slowly, heavily. Every step striking straight through her pelvis, one hand supporting the underside of her belly, while the other swung outward to keep her balance, and something inside her shifted with every impact of her feet against the ground. She heard footsteps behind her, and those footsteps were twice as fast as her own. She charged toward the parking lot exit. Beside the building stood a blue plastic bucket filled with road salt, left there since the snowstorm the week before, and Marin didn't think. She grabbed the handle with her whole hand and threw it behind her, and the bucket overturned, white salt spilling across the wet concrete, and she heard a curse and the sound of someone slipping. She fell at the exit. She went down on her side, shoulder first, because that instinct had already settled into her body by the 5th month and needed no instruction. The absolute instinct never to let her belly strike the ground. Her shoulder hit the concrete. The black and white sheet flew from her hand, flipped twice in the wind, and stuck against the tire of a parked car. She lay there for 1.5 seconds. Then she planted one hand against the ground and stood. She didn't pick up the paper. Winnie was out of the car and shouting something, and she was running toward them at 61 years old, and one of the men turned his head to look at her, and that half second was all Marin needed. She burst onto Ashland Street. To the right was the residential neighborhood. Houses, fences, backyards, locked doors, strangers, doors she would have to pound on and explain herself behind, then wait while people decided whether they believed her. And she had lived long enough to know how much time people took to decide whether to believe someone like her. To the left, at the bottom of the slope beyond the warehouses, lay the gray line of Lake Michigan and the cranes standing motionless against the afternoon sky. The harbor. The harbor was closed. The harbor was empty. The harbor held 42 containers standing dead still in the yard, 3 locked gates, 27 rows of warehouses, corridors she had walked through at 2 o'clock in the morning for 6 years while delivering food to night workers. Doors she knew would jam and doors she knew would open. Fences where she knew the gaps. Shortcuts that appeared on no Rourke Holdings map. The two men knew the harbor as the place where they worked. Maren Delaney knew the harbor as the place she walked. She turned left. For 6 years, 3 nights a week, between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning, Maren Delaney had walked through this harbor with a paper bag of steaks and coffee in her hand. The crane operator in Tower 4 wanted soup. The maintenance crew in Warehouse 11 wanted sandwiches. The old man in the generator room wanted black coffee without sugar, and he paid with coins counted out in advance and kept inside a tin box. None of them ever came outside to meet her. They told her the back door was open. "Child, just come in." So she went in. For 6 years, she had passed through doors Rourke Holdings didn't know anyone was using, doors without cameras because the cameras had been positioned to watch containers, not people carrying food, and she had learned them the way a person learned the stairs in her own home in darkness, not with her mind but with her feet. She slipped through the opening in the western fence, a gap someone had cut long ago, so workers could take a shortcut to the grocery store. A gap no one had ever repaired. Repairing it would force the workers to go around, and going around would add another 4 minutes into every shift. The two men behind her needed 10 seconds to find the opening. She ran along the row of refrigerated containers, the row whose power had been shut off because the harbor was closed, and she didn't run straight. She turned at the 4th container, then again at the 9th, and she heard the footsteps behind her hesitate for 1 beat at every turn, and every beat of hesitation gave her back 1 meter. She wasn't faster than they were. She only knew which paths ended in walls. 31 weeks pregnant, she breathed through her mouth. A hot cord seemed to run along her left side, and every step pulled it tight. But she had carried trays for 6 years, and the thing no one told people about waiting tables was that it wasn't a job of the hands. It was a job of the feet, and Maren Delaney's feet had walked 12 hours a night for 6 years, and they knew how not to stop. She turned through the side door of Warehouse B. The corridor in Warehouse B was 40 meters long, narrow, with a low ceiling, running along the outer wall, and there was nothing inside it but several electrical cabinets and a row of lights, half of which had burned out. There was exactly 1 door at the far end, a steel door with peeling holder. It was a dead end. Anyone who entered knew it was a dead end. The two men behind her saw her turn into it and slowed down, and one of them gave a short laugh, the laugh of a man who had just watched his prey climb into its own sack, because the steel door at the end of the Warehouse B corridor couldn't be opened. It had been jammed since the summer 2 years earlier, when the frame shifted after the floor was repaired, and Rourke Holdings had placed it on the maintenance list, and that list was 2 pages long, and the door sat on the last line of the 2nd page. Anyone who pulled the handle found that it didn't move. People tried once, then gave up. Someone had taped a sheet of paper to it with broken door printed across it, and the paper had yellowed and peeled loose at one corner. But the door wasn't broken. It was only misaligned, and if someone lifted the handle about 1 centimeter before pushing, the upper latch slipped free of the warped frame, and the door opened as easily as any other door in the world. Maren Delaney had known that since July 2 years earlier, at 2:10 in the morning, when she had stood there with a bag of steaks ground cold and tried lifting the handle, because she didn't want to walk an extra 4 minutes around the building. She ran to the end of the corridor. She put her hand on the handle. She lifted. She pushed. The door opened, and she stepped through and closed it behind her, and she heard 2 bodies strike the steel from the other side. Once, then twice, and she heard the handle being yanked down, 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 the movement everyone in the world made with a jammed door, and no one ever thought to reverse. She stood with her back against the door and breathed, and for 4 seconds she thought of nothing at all. Then she heard steel begin to shriek. A warped frame also meant the latch didn't sit deeply. That door wouldn't hold for long against 2 angry men. Maren ran into the yard behind Warehouse B, and she made it only 15 meters. Footsteps sounded from the far end of the yard, and there was something she hadn't anticipated, not much because she was foolish, but because in 6 years of crossing this harbor at 2 o'clock in the morning, no one had ever been waiting for her at the other end. A 3rd man, standing at the auxiliary gate. Everett Vance wore a blue wool coat and leather gloves, and he didn't run. He only stood there and spoke in the reasonable voice of a man helping her see something she should have seen for herself if only she had been a little calmer. "Miss Delaney," he said, "give me the notebook." She stepped backward. The other two men had made it out of the corridor. She could hear them behind her. She stood in the middle of the wet concrete yard, 31 weeks pregnant, both arms wrapped around the cloth bag holding 11 notebooks, and she looked around and understood that this time there was no door. Vance stepped forward. He reached out his hand, and the yard to her right exploded into white. Fire extinguisher powder burst outward in a thick cloud, so dense that for 2 seconds no one could see anything, and inside that cloud came coughing, stumbling, and the sound of a 58-year-old man breathing like a forge bellows. Gideon Pike had run 60 meters from the gate, 3 security booth, with the red extinguisher clutched across his stomach, and he didn't say a word. He only squeezed the trigger and swept it from side to side, from side to side, from side to side, exactly the way they had taught him at Station 21 30 years earlier. Someone caught Marin's arm inside the white dust. Then a voice came from the auxiliary gate, and it wasn't loud, and the entire yard fell silent. Everett. Cormac Rourke stood at the entrance to the auxiliary gate with one hand braced on his cane, his face as white as the wall, and behind him were 2 cars with their headlights still burning. He held nothing. He pointed at no one. "Let go of her," he said. White powder drifted slowly through the frozen air. "You have 3 seconds, Cormac said, and I'm counting more slowly than usual because I'm injured." The hand released Marin's arm. The cloth bag slipped from her shoulder and fell, and several notebooks slid out, and the 10th one, the dark blue notebook with the curled upper edge, fell open into a puddle of melted snow in the middle of the yard. Marin Delaney lowered herself to her knees, leaning to one side, and lifted it with both hands. Water streamed from the pages. She turned them. The ink didn't run. Not a single word blurred, because for 6 years she had written orders with hands wet from dishwater, in the rain beside the back door, with fingers that had just pulled ice from a bucket. And for her 2nd month on the job, she had stopped buying cheap pens and started buying waterproof ink, $2.45 apiece, at the stationery store on Halsted Street. And she had continued buying them for 6 years without ever thinking of it as a decision. She stood in the middle of the yard, wet to her elbows, and held the notebook against her chest. They led Everett Vance to the car, and he went calmly. He even brushed the white powder from the shoulders of his blue wool coat before sitting down, and throughout the entire process he didn't say a single word, because he was the kind of man who knew exactly which moments made opening his mouth expensive. The other 2 men had been taken away first. Cormac Rourke stood in the middle of the yard with one hand resting on his cane, and he watched until the car door closed. Then he turned to the man standing beside him, the man he had called for 40 seconds that morning, the man with a name, a file, and 11 years of service. "Who do you report to?" Cormac asked. The man hesitated. Cormac didn't ask again. He only looked at him, "Mr. Vance." The man said. Cormac Rourke stood motionless. Inside his mind, everything arranged itself into its proper place in about 2 seconds, and the feeling that came with it was unlike anything he had ever known. He had made the call. He had said, "Stay near her. Don't let her see you. Report back to me every evening." He had read the Bridgeport address aloud. He had done it in 40 seconds, and he hadn't thought about it for another second afterward, because in his world, when he spoke a sentence, that sentence carried itself out, and never once in all 34 years of his life had he been required to consider whose ears it passed through before becoming real. He walked toward Marin. She was sitting on the concrete steps beside Warehouse B, shivering in her soaked clothes, still holding the blue-covered notebook against her chest. Winnie Halloran sat beside her with one hand on her back. Gideon Pike stood 3 meters away, still clutching the empty fire extinguisher across his stomach because he had forgotten to put it down. Cormac stopped in front of her. "I sent someone to watch over you," he said. Moran looked up. "Yesterday morning. I called and told them to stay near you. I gave them your home address." He stopped. I led him to you," he said. Marin said nothing. She opened her mouth as though she meant to speak, and then her entire body went rigid. It wasn't like the other times. The other times had been tightening and then release, her body clearing its throat. This began in her lower back and tightened around the front, as though someone had looped a cord around her waist and pulled both ends, and it didn't soften. Her hand clenched the edge of the concrete step until her knuckles turned white and she bent forward, unable to breathe. Winnie said, "Child." Winnie said, "Marin." Cormac Rourke pulled out his phone. He had taken out a phone thousands of times in his life, and every time it had been to tell someone what to do. This time he pressed 3 numbers and waited, and when someone answered, he heard his own voice say words he had never spoken before. "There is a woman who is 31 weeks pregnant," he said. "West Auxiliary Gate, Calumet Harbor. Behind Warehouse B, she is having a contraction. The first one began at 4:51. He looked at his watch. 4:52, he said. "It still hasn't stopped." The person on the other end asked who he was. He gave his name and said nothing more about who he was, and that, too, was a first. "The ambulance is on its way," the dispatcher said. 7 minutes. Cormac placed the phone on the concrete step, with the screen still glowing and the speaker still on, then sat down. He lowered himself by bracing on the cane little by little, and for 1 second he had to stop halfway, and Gideon Pike stepped forward to support his elbow, and Cormac Rourke allowed him to. The contraction ended. Marin tilted her head back against the corrugated metal wall and released a long, trembling breath. 4 minutes. She breathed. Winnie rubbed her back. A thin layer of white fire extinguisher powder covered the yard, and snow had begun falling again. Small, scattered flakes, not enough to settle. Cormac sat 1 meter away from her on the cold concrete step, both hands resting on his cane, staring straight ahead. "Miss Delaney," he said. She didn't turn her head. "Why did you save me?" Snow fell. "You knew who I was," he said. "You knew from the beginning. I listened to the emergency call again. You gave the dispatcher my name before they asked. Miss Delaney, everyone in this harbor knows who I am, and not one of them would have stopped if they had found me beneath that steel at 2 o'clock in the morning. Not one. I know exactly what kind of man I am. I spent 34 years becoming the kind of man people don't stop for." He turned his head and looked at her. "You had 3 minutes. You could have walked away. You could have gone back to the kitchen, washed that tray, and no one in this world would ever have known you passed through the door of Warehouse D. Why didn't you walk away?" Marin Delaney didn't look at him. She looked toward the docks, where the crane stood motionless against the fading afternoon sky, a line of black iron 27 meters high, still in the snow like a row of people bowing their heads. "Because I wasn't there the last time, at 9 o'clock the following morning, on the 7th floor of the Rourke Holdings building, inside the conference room with 3 glass walls overlooking Lake Michigan." Gray as steel, Marin Delaney was present because she had insisted on being there, and she had insisted because the night before at the hospital, they had told her the contractions had stopped completely, and that she could go home if she remained lying down, and she had thanked the doctor, then taken the number 30 bus at 7 o'clock that morning. She sat at the head of the table. No one had to push out a chair for her. Cormac Rourke sat opposite, his cane standing beside the leg of his chair. Winnie Halloran leaned against the wall, because she said she didn't sit in rooms like this. A doctor stood at the far end of the room, a physician from Mercy Southside Hospital, who had been invited to present the medical record, and he waited for his turn with a leather briefcase resting on his lap. Sloane Rourke stood at the other end of the table. She didn't open a single file. That was the first thing Cormac noticed, because in 20 years he had never seen his sister speak without papers in front of her. 8 months ago, Sloane said, "I began watching Everett Vance." Cormac didn't move. "I didn't tell you because you would have confronted him," she said. "That's how you do everything. You look a man straight in the face and say, 'I know,' then you watch to see how he reacts. That works on 90% of the men in the world. It wouldn't have worked on him. He would have stopped, behaved himself for 2 years, then started all over again somewhere else we couldn't see." She placed both hands on the table, so I let him continue. "I needed him to commit the crime in a place I chose, at a time I chose, with something I chose. I chose Warehouse D. I chose pallet number 40. And in November, I replaced the human resources safe with a mechanical lock and gave him the key. And I wrote in the record that it was because he supervised personnel, and not one person in that room questioned it." She looked directly at her younger brother. "I gave him the key, Cormac. I knew who I was giving it to. I wanted him to use it." No one in the room drew a heavy breath. "I set a trap for a theft," Sloane said. "I didn't set a trap for a death. I calculated everything. I calculated that he would wait for the quietest night at the harbor, that he would need a forklift in 30 minutes, that he would erase the cameras because he had authorization to erase the cameras. And I left that authorization in place because I needed him to believe he was safe. I had someone at gate 1 from 11 o'clock that night. I had 2 more people in the outer container yard. By the following morning, I would have had him, footage from my cameras rather than the company's cameras, and $2,300,000 worth of cargoes sitting on his truck. She stopped. I didn't know you were in Warehouse D. Cormac said nothing. You didn't tell anyone. You didn't put it on your schedule. Your car didn't enter through the main gate. I checked 3 times, and there wasn't a single line showing that you intended to go there, and I still don't understand why you went, and you still won't answer me. She paused, and Cormac remained silent, and the entire room could see the emptiness between them. He didn't intend to kill anyone, Sloane said, her voice beginning to lower. He cut the cable to create a warehouse accident, to trigger an insurance investigation, to provide an explanation for why one pallet was no longer there. He cut it shortly before 1:30. Then you walked in. She looked down at the table. I have recalculated that night more times than I can count. I calculated the distance from where the cable snapped to where you were standing. I calculated the wait. I calculated that you had 6 minutes. She raised her eyes. I calculated that you had 6 minutes. At the far end of the room, the doctor placed his leather briefcase on the floor and straightened. He had 3, the doctor said. No one spoke. Sloane Rourke remained standing for another moment. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down, and she lowered herself very slowly, so slowly that it looked as though the chair beneath her wasn't real, and she had to search for it with her hands. And in 20 years of practicing law for this family, no one had ever seen Sloane Rourke sit down that way. She didn't apologize. She didn't say another word. She only looked at her hands resting on the glass tabletop, while beyond the windows Lake Michigan lay silent and gray, without a single ship. The conference room door opened. The secretary stood there and said she was sorry, but someone wanted to come in. He didn't have an appointment. He said he worked night security. Cormac Rourke said, "Let him in." Gideon Pike entered the 7th floor conference room of the Rourke Holdings building, wearing work boots that still had fire extinguisher powder on the toes. His shift had ended at 7 o'clock that morning, and he hadn't gone home. He walked to the head of the table, and in that room full of glass and people in suits, he looked at no one except Cormac. He placed a cloth bundle on the table. He opened it. Inside was a cable-cutting knife with a black rubber handle and a short blade curved like a claw. It was beneath pallet number 40, Gideon said. I picked it up at 2:10 while I was helping her lift the beam from your chest. Mr. Vance returned to the warehouse at 5 minutes before 3, and he searched for it for 40 minutes. I sat in the booth and watched him look. Sloane's head snapped up. You kept it for 12 days. Yes, Gideon said. Why didn't you say anything? The 58-year-old man stood straight with both hands at his sides, and he answered by looking directly into Cormac Rourke's eyes. I waited 6 years, he said, for someone in this room to be willing to look me in the face. The knife lay in the middle of the glass table, and no one touched it. Sloane Rourke looked at it for a long time. Then she raised her eyes and asked again, the question she had asked in room 412 one evening 12 days earlier, the question her younger brother had let fall to the floor and stepped over. What were you doing in Warehouse D at 1 o'clock in the morning? Cormac Rourke sat in silence for about 5 seconds. Then he said, Give me my briefcase. Someone handed it to him. He opened the lock, took out a thin file, and placed it on the table about 1 handspan from the knife. I went there to get this, he said. No one reached for it. The physical records of workplace accidents are kept in Warehouse D, Cormac said. 3rd shelf from the north wall, bottom compartment, gray box. The most recent 7 years. We didn't digitize them because legal counsel said we shouldn't. Do you remember, Sloane? You were the one who advised against it. Sloane didn't answer. I went in at 1:40, he said. I went alone because I didn't want a second person knowing what I was aching. I found the box. I was holding it when the row of shelving came down. He pushed the file another 2 centimeters toward the center of the table. Crane accident, Tower 4, Crew 147. Internal investigation, finding operator error, compensation. Reason compensation was denied. Employee violated safety procedure. He stopped. The employee's name was Rowan Delaney, Winnie Halloran. Still leaning against the wall at the far end of the room, raised one hand to her mouth. Cormac didn't look at Marin. He stared down at the tabletop. "The signature at the bottom is mine," he said. "I signed it a week later. I signed 41 documents that day. I didn't read a single one. They put them in front of me, told me everything was finished, and I signed. That's how I signed papers for 12 years. He turned the ring on his finger once, then stopped. 3 weeks before that day, he said, a man stopped me in the container yard. He didn't have an appointment. Security was about to remove him, and I said no, let him speak. He said the crane at Tower 4 had a problem with its secondary braking system. He had reported it 3 times in writing, and no one had responded. He said, "Mr. Rourke, that crane is going to kill someone." He lifted his eyes. I said I would have someone inspect it. I said it in the voice people use to end a conversation. He knew. I could see that he knew. But he didn't lower his eyes. He stood there and looked directly into mine for 30 seconds, then said, "Thank you for listening," and turned around and went back to work. In 6 years at this harbor, not one person had looked me in the eye like that, not one. 3 weeks later, someone called and told me there had been an accident at Tower 4. The room was so quiet that the ventilation system could be heard. "For 6 months I haven't been able to sleep," Cormac said. "Not because of my conscience. I don't have one of those, and you know it. Because the conclusion didn't fit. A man who violated safety procedure wasn't the same man who had reported a braking system failure 3 times in writing. Those weren't the same person. Someone wrote that conclusion, and someone placed it on my desk with 40 other pages, and I signed it." He continued, his voice still even. "Had I reopened the investigation through official channels, the person who wrote that conclusion would have known 3 days before I did. So I didn't go through official channels. I waited until the harbor was quiet, and I went retrieve the box myself." He placed both hands on the table. "I was lying beneath that steel 4 meters from the box," he said. "I could see it. It was lying on its side 4 meters from my hand, and I couldn't reach it." Sloane Rourke said, her voice gone rough. "You nearly died for a piece of paper." "No," Cormac said. He turned his head, and for the first time since entering the room, he looked directly at the woman seated at the opposite end of the table. For a name. Marin Delaney sat perfectly still. Both hands rested on the green-covered notebook she had brought from home. She didn't cry. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and between them stretched a glass table 4 meters long, exactly the distance between where he had lain and the gray box. And inside that distance was everything they had both just understood at the same time. She had dropped to her knees on the concrete floor at 149. She had pressed her apron into the wound of the man who had signed the paper saying her husband had caused his own death. She had twisted the tourniquet, one turn tighter after seeing the anchor tattoo on his wrist. And he, lying beneath 3 tons of steel with 3 minutes left in his life, had called out the only name among those 41 names that he still remembered. Cormac turned back towards Sloane. "Call the police," he said. Everyone in the room looked up. "Cormac?" Sloane said. "The knife, the access card records, Mr. Pike's notebook, Miss Delaney's notebooks. Package everything. Call the county. I'll sit there for as long as they need me." Sloane said, "Do you understand what you just said? We don't hand our own people over to them. Father never did. Father died in a warehouse," Cormac said. 4 hours passed before anyone came. "Do you remember who sat there with him?" Sloane didn't answer. "Make the call," he said. 6 days later, Sloane Rourke knocked on the door of the 3rd-floor apartment in Bridgeport, alone, without her younger brother beside her. And when Marin opened it, the 39-year-old lawyer stood in the dark hallway and said, "May I come in?" And Marin opened the door all the way. Sloane didn't sit down. She placed an envelope on the kitchen table and said, "I didn't come here to give you money," and Marin said, "I know." Sloane said, "I make my living reading files. I'm better at that than anything else I have ever done. Last week, I began looking through your records for a weakness, because that's what I always do. I examine people's records and look for the place where they break. I traced yours back to your grandmother." She pushed the envelope a little farther across the table. "Inside is Perpetua Doyle's handwritten resignation letter," she said. "Signed decades ago, on a cold spring morning. Cook County Hospital kept it in her personnel file and never released it publicly. I had to invoke 3 separate laws to get it. Read it." Then Sloane Rourke walked out and closed the door behind her. Marin sat down. She opened the envelope. There were 2 sheets inside. The first was a copy of a disciplinary report, typed, dry, 9 lines long. Decades ago, at 4:02 in the morning, A young teenage female patient was brought into the emergency department at Cook County Hospital. No insurance, no guardian present. Under the intake procedures in effect at that time, an uninsured patient without a confirmed emergency condition was required to be transferred to a lower-level public facility. The physician on duty ordered the transfer at 4:20. Charge Nurse Perpetua Doyle refused to carry out the transfer order. Nurse Doyle kept the patient in the department. Nurse Doyle assumed written professional responsibility for the patient at 4:35. The patient gave birth at 7:15 that morning. Female infant, 2.8 kilograms. Both mother and infant were in stable condition. Both were discharged after 48 hours. Charge Nurse Perpetua Doyle received notice of termination at 9 o'clock that same morning. Marin read those 9 lines 3 times. Then she returned to the second sheet. This one was handwritten. She recognized the writing immediately. Strong, the slanting script. Slightly difficult to read. At the final letter of every word, the handwriting that had covered thousands of labels in her grandmother's kitchen throughout her childhood. The letter was short. 4 sentences. I have read the procedure. I understand the procedure. I don't dispute that the procedure is correct. I only say that there are nights when people mustn't do what is correct. Signed, Perpetua Doyle. Decades ago. Marin looked at the date. She looked at it for a very long time. Then she placed the sheet on the kitchen table and raised both hands to cover her mouth. April 17th, 7:15 in the morning. A healthy female infant. It was her. Since the day she was born, Perpetua Doyle had raised her. For decades, Perpetua had scrubbed floors in that same hospital, because nowhere else in the city would hire a nurse. All her life, she had taught Marin how to stop bleeding in the kitchen with a dish towel, taught her to watch the color, taught her to record the time, taught her that when pressure failed, she must stop it above the wound. All those years, and she had never said a single word. Not once. Not when Marin was 10 and asked why she didn't work as a nurse anymore. Not when Marin was 22 and brought home her Malcolm X college student card, and Perpetua sat at the kitchen table and smiled and said nothing at all. You didn't save a stranger, Marin said aloud in the empty apartment. You saved me. Winnie Halloran arrived at 7 o'clock that evening carrying a pot of soup, and she saw the paper on the kitchen table and read it while standing, still holding the lid of the pot in one hand, and then she dropped heavily into a chair. She placed the lid on the table and said, Child, I have something to tell you too. Marin looked up. Your notebook, Winnie said. The 10th one. That night. Marin's entire body went rigid. I tore it out, Winnie said. Beyond the window, the brick wall stood as still as it had always stood. Rowan came to the restaurant that night, Winnie said. 11:40. He sat at table 6. He waited there for an hour. Then Everett Vance arrived, and I brought out the coffee because you were in the kitchen, and I didn't want you coming out. She took a breath. I heard everything, child. I stood 2 meters away and wiped table 7, spotless for 15 minutes, and I heard every word. He talked about the secondary break. He said he had reported it 3 times. Vance told him the matter had already been reviewed and that he should go back and do his job. Rowan said that if no one reviewed it, he would report it outside the company. Vance said, Do you understand what you just said? And Rowan said, Yes, I do. Winnie placed both hands on her lap. I knew that he knew, child. I saw his face when he stood up from that table. He knew what was waiting for him. And the next morning, he still got up at 5 o'clock, and he still climbed Tower 4 and 3 weeks later. She didn't finish the sentence. When did you tear out the page? Marin asked. The night he died, Winnie said. I went into the restaurant at 2 o'clock in the morning. I used my key to open the locker. I took your notebook from your apron pocket, tore out that page, and burned it in the sink. Why? Marin said. Winnie Halloran, 61 years old, raised her eyes, and they were red and her voice broke. I didn't tear it out to hide anything from them, child, she said. They already knew everything. What would they need with my piece of paper? I tore it out so you could sleep. Marin Delaney sat in silence for a very long time. I haven't slept in 6 months, Miss Winnie. 3 weeks later, at the payment counter on the first floor of Mercy Southside Hospital. A man leaning on a cane placed his card on the counter and said, I'm paying the entire balance on Marin Delaney's account. All of it, from February until the day she gives birth, including the full postpartum follow-up package. The clerk typed for a while, then asked, May I have the name of the person making the payment, sir? Corm Gork looked down at her keyboard for about 3 seconds. Put down Rowan Delaney, he said. Marin learned about it 4 days later, when the statement arrived at the third-floor apartment. She took 2 buses to the Holdings building with the paper in her hand. And she didn't have an appointment, but they still allowed her up to the 7th floor. "You had no right to use his name," she said. "I know," Cormac said. "And why did you do it?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the lake. "Because the baby will grow up," he said, "and one day, he'll open the box of papers." "Everyone opens the box of papers sooner or later, Miss Delaney. He'll look for where he came from. And when he sees the name written beside the payment for the day he entered this world, I want him to see his father's name." He turned back toward her. "Not mine. I don't deserve to stand in that place." And Marin Delaney, who hadn't cried in Warehouse D at 2:00 in the morning, hadn't cried during 3 hours in the glass conference room, hadn't cried in the clinic parking lot with $212 in her wallet, hadn't cried when she opened the refrigerator, hadn't cried when she read the 9 lines of that report from decades ago, stood on the 7th floor of the Rourke Holdings building and began to weep. 6 months later, 31st Street, Bridgeport. The old storefront at number 412 had once sold hardware, then stood empty for 6 years, and now it had a hand-painted wooden sign hanging on the glass door, white letters against a dark blue background. The Doyle First Aid Room. Free. Open Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7:00 in the evening. There were 19 people inside, 4 container truck drivers, 2 night security guards, 3 waitresses, a hotel housekeeper who had just finished her shift, several warehouse workers, people who arrived at an emergency scene 11 minutes, 15 minutes, sometimes 20 minutes before the ambulance, and during those 11 minutes, they were everything the injured person had. Winnie Halloran brought a tray of pastries covered in aluminum foil and placed it where she declared was the only sensible place, which meant as far away from the paperwork as possible. Gideon Pike brought the green steel toolbox with paint chipped from all 4 corners, and he said every respectable establishment in the world needed an old man who knew how to repair a hinge without calling a professional. In the corner of the room, where the late afternoon sunlight came through the large window and formed a gold rectangle across the wooden floor, there was a cradle. Inside it slept a 4-month-old baby boy, both hands loosely curled beside his head, breathing evenly. On the wall above the cradle hung a photograph in aluminum frame, showing a brown-haired man standing in front of a crane, smiling with his sleeves rolled up, an anchor tattoo visible on his wrist. Rowan Delaney Jr. slept through the entire class. He always slept through the entire class. Winnie said the boy was already accustomed to the sound of people. Cormac Rourke arrived 20 minutes late. He came to the door leaning on his cane, then hid it behind his back and walked in on both legs. And he managed exactly 4 steps before Winnie Halloran turned and looked at him. He sat down. At the back of the room stood a 15-year-old girl with braided hair and both arms folded tightly across her chest. Tavia Okonjo. Her father had driven container trucks on the Calumet route for 14 years, and he had attended this class from the very first session, and that week he had brought his daughter with him. She stood at the back of the room for 40 minutes without asking a single question. Marin saw her. Marin recognized that posture. It was the posture of a dream waiting to be laughed at. "What's your name?" Marin asked. "Tavia, Mom. What do you want to do?" The girl shrugged. "I want to operate a crane, like my father." Someone in those gave a soft whistle. Mr. Okonjo smiled, the kind of smile worn by a father trying not to look too openly proud. "Then why are you standing at the back of the room?" Marin asked. Tavia tightened her folded arms. "This is for people who know medicine, Mom. Can someone like me learn this?" The room fell silent. Marin Delaney walked over, pulled the cardiopulmonary resuscitation mannequin into the center of the floor, and motioned with her hand. "Come here." Tavia approached slowly. Marin took the girl's hands, placed one over the other, then positioned them in the correct place at the center of the mannequin's chest. "Push down," she said. The girl pushed. Harder. The girl pushed harder, and the mannequin made a clicking sound. "That's right," Marin said. "Now count." She stood behind the girl with one hand resting lightly on her shoulder and counted with her. 1, 2, 3, 4. And all 19 people in the room began counting with them. "Do you know the first lie people teach us?" Marin asked, still counting. "That you have to be rich before you're allowed to save someone. That you need a degree, a white coat, and someone else's permission. I believed that for my later years." The girl reached 30, then looked up. her face flushed and her breathing quick. My grandmother taught me 3 things, Marin said. I'll teach them to you. First, look at the color of the blood before you look at the wound. The color tells how much time you have left. Second, write down the time. Always write down the time. No one trusts the memory of poor people, so don't give them your memory. Give them a number. Third, if your hands shake, let them shake. Don't waste your strength trying to make them stop, but don't let go. Tavia nodded. Then she looked up at the hand-painted wooden sign hanging inside the glass door. Who was Doyle? She asked. It was my grandmother's last name, Marin said. She died a few years ago. The girl looked at her curiously. Why didn't you use your husband's name? Delaney sounds nicer. Marin was silent for a moment. Because Delaney is the name I gave my son, she said. Doyle is the name of the woman who taught me how to keep him alive. At the back of the room, Cormac released a long breath. This time it came easily. Marin looked up and saw him. He looked back at her. She gave him a single nod. Then she turned back to the girl and said, Do it again. This time, I won't count for you. For 6 years, people called Marin Delaney Miss. They called her, Hey, you, the coffee girl, or whatever your name is. No one asked her name now. Inside an old storefront on 31st Street. People called her by her name, and they learned how to save one another from the very hands no one had been willing to notice for 6 years. This story leaves us with a few very simple truths. Dignity isn't something handed down from above. It is something recognized. Caring for others is a skill, learned, practiced, and passed on, not a weak instinct belonging to those without power or status. And there are many people in this world whom we notice only when they are cleaning up what someone else has spilled, people who pour our coffee, guard our gates, and mop the floors behind us. And every one of them has a name, a life, and a grandmother who once taught them something important. Today, when you have the chance to ask the name of someone like that, ask. Sometimes being truly seen is the only thing a person is still missing. When this story has touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you believe needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to compelling stories every day. How did you feel about Marin Delaney's story? About Perpetua, Gideon, and Winnie? When you have also had someone quietly standing behind you, like that in your own life, please leave a comment. We sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.